In this video, I will explain why the Slavic world is divided into completely different alphabets and why it's mostly Russia's fault. In 1863, the Russian Empire tried to force us Poles into writing our own language in Cyrillic. However, it failed because by 1863 the alphabet wasn't just letters anymore, it was part of our symbolic identity. And today, around 280 million Slavic speakers write in two completely different alphabets. Same language families, similar languages, but completely different scripts. Hey Slavic Vikings, and I've lived in Poland for most of my life, and when the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, Warsaw got flooded with a bunch of Ukrainian refugees. And to this day, when you enter a żabka in Warsaw, you'll probably hear Ukrainian before you hear Polish. So in the first couple of months of this invasion, I started to learn the Cyrillic alphabet. And once I did, I came to realize how similar Polish and Ukrainian actually are. But then the obvious question comes up, why do we then write in completely different alphabets? And today I'll explain the historical reasons for this separation, as well as the cultural and political implications, since the line between Latin and Cyrillic lines up almost perfectly with the religious split between Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. And interestingly also the borders of the European Union, and this overlap will make more sense later on. But in short, to answer the question, the reason for this divide is because the Latin clergy got to the Western Slavs first, both metaphorically and literally, like you will find out. Then for a brief moment they almost had their own Slavic alphabet, not Cyrillic but its older original cousin called Glagolitic, invented for them in Moravia or Czechia in 863. Just take a look at how cool it looks. And the Western Slavs almost adopted this weird looking alphabet instead of Latin, but the idea was crushed in 885. So by the time Cyrillic got invented and existed as a working system, Poland, Bohemia, Slovakia, Sorbs, and the rest were already 2 generations into Latin. And therefore Cyrillic never really competed directly in Western Slavic lands. The competition was already lost before Cyrillic was even born. So that was the TLDR answer to this video, but let's dive deeper. In 862, Great Moravia was already Christian, and the Moravian prince of Rastislav wrote to Byzantium asking for some clergy, but not for religious reasons. Instead, he wanted clergy who did not report back to East Francia. Because when you take Frankish priests, that also means Frankish bishops taking over, and that means a slow takeover from the empire next door. And throughout history, but especially in the Dark Ages, religion was directly linked to political power and everything else. So Byzantium sent 2 brothers, Cyril and Methodius. Cyril was a philosophy professor at Constantinople with a diplomatic track record in the Khazar Khaganate. So these so-called clergy were more intellectual diplomats than religious missionaries. And like I said, 1,000 years ago, almost everything was directly or indirectly linked to religion. So religion was not part of society, but it was the foundation of everything intellectual. And so, the 2 invited brothers, out of their own initiative, built a completely new alphabet called Glagolitic. A new angular and unique script designed on purpose to not look like Greek, Latin, or Hebrew. Cyrillic did not yet exist back then. It would be many decades before it did get invented, partly from this exact alphabet that Cyril and Methodius wrote. However, in response to the creation of the Glagolitic alphabet, Frankish clergy lost their minds. They invoked the Trilingual Heresy Act, the doctrine that only Hebrew, Greek, and Latin were acceptable for Christian liturgy. But the brothers did not give up, and they went to Rome to defend their alphabet, an alphabet that was created specifically for the Slavic sounds. In 867, Rome and Constantinople were technically one church still. The Great Schism was almost 200 years away, and back then Pope Adrian II approved the Slavic liturgy. However, Cyril later died in Rome and was buried at the Basilica of San Clemente. So the first official Slavic liturgical books were blessed in Rome. Kinda interesting to think about that this happened so away from the Slavic lands. But however, with his brother dead, Methodius went back alone to Czechia, but the Frankish bishops ambushed him on the way and threw him to prison for 2.5 years. Pope John VIII forced his release, however, and in 8080 this John guy issued the Industrije Tuae, which means that the Slavic liturgy was formally approved and Glagolitic was named Glagolitic. But then it all collapsed very fast when Methodius died and John VIII died. The new pope, Stephen V, issued a papal bull banning Slavic liturgy in Moravia entirely, so everything was stepped back. One of the Frankish bishops, however, a man named Witching, forged fake papal letters to justify the ban and accused Methodius' disciples of heresy. And Prince Svatopluk was the ruler of Moravia at the time, and he was the man whose entire diplomatic strategy depended on independent Slavic clergy. So when the dispute between Witching and Methodius' disciples erupted, he had to pick a side. And he picked the worst possible way to decide which side to follow, and that being ruling that whoever swore an oath of loyalty first was right. And so basically the two groups rushed to see who got there first, and the Frankish bishops got there first, and so Svatopluk sided with the Franks. So the entire future of Slavic civilization was decided by a literal race. The disciples were then arrested, and the younger disciples were sold to slave traders. And then, when Svatopluk finally died in 894, his sons feuded, and around 907 the Magyars destroyed Moravia entirely, those gosh darn Hungarians, so this literal weird betrayal was for nothing. The exiles fled to Bulgaria because Bulgaria's Khan, Boris I, had the same problem as Ratislav, but in reverse. He wanted clergy independent from the Greeks. The Moravian exiles were therefore politically perfect. So around 886, the Clement of Ohrid set up a school in southwest of Bulgaria, and he kept using Glagolitic. Further east, under Tsar Simon I Literary School, the disciples and their students developed a completely new alphabet, drawing on Greek letters they already knew and also parts of the Glagolitic alphabet they had just been forced to abandon, and this alphabet they created got called Cyrillic, named after the Cyril brother who died from earlier. And once Bulgaria standardized the system, Cyrillic didn't spread as just an alphabet, it came as a full package. Scripture, trained clergy, liturgy, legal formulas, an entire bureaucratic culture was ready to go with Cyrillic. Catholic Rome insisted on Latin for worship, pushing newly converted Slavs in the West towards the Latin alphabet, while those under Constantinople's influence adopted Cyrillic instead. So the reason why the Slavs are alphabetically divided is in fact religion. Slavs are, and have been and always will be, divided by their different religious denominations, and this is directly linked to their scripts and languages. When Vladimir of Rus converted in 888, he didn't just import the religion, he imported a functioning literate civilization. And unlike Rome, which insisted all languages of church worship had to be in Latin, Constantinople had no such rule. The Trilingual Heresy wasn't some fringe argument that the Frankish bishops invented to attack Cyril and Methodius specifically, it was a standard doctrine across the entire Western Church for centuries. Latin was the sacred language of God himself, which meant every people who converted to Catholicism had to worship the language that wasn't theirs. They had to learn Latin, or stay illiterate in their own faith. And Constantinople did not work that way. The Eastern Church had no equivalent doctrine locking liturgy to Greek or another language. Orthodoxy never claimed Greek was uniquely sacred explicitly. Instead, the script and religion fused over time, because the religious doctrine actively allowed it. So I just described how around the year 900 in Bulgaria, the Cyrillic language expanded across Eastern Europe. Now look at what's happening in the Western Slavic lands at the exact same time. Poland wasn't even Christian yet, Bohemia was already being converted to Latin by the clergy, Slovakia, the heart of the Great Moravia, was being absorbed into Catholic Kingdom of Hungary, and the Sorbs were surrounded by the Catholic Holy Roman Empire. So when Cyrillic finally existed as a usable alphabet, every single Western Slavic peoples were already fully in the Latin system, or about to be. And there was no Cyrillic missionary, no Cyrillic clergy, no Cyrillic school even, anywhere west of Bulgaria. And the most important year for Poland, which every kid, including me, was forced to learn, is 966. The baptism of Poland to Catholicism through its king Mieszko I. This was done through Bohemia, the Latin clergy and the Latin books. April 14th, 966 was the day Poland officially rejected paganism in the name of Catholicism, which to this day is a crucial part of Polish identity. And since Catholicism was so inextricably linked to Latin, Poland adopted the Latin alphabet and many Latin words. Latin meant law, administration, and correspondence with every major Western ruler on the continent. So not so different of a thought process as countries today choosing to join the European Union. However, the Latin alphabet wasn't built for the Slavic sounds. You know, sh, ch, z, zh, j, z, all those weird Slavic sounds that simply don't exist in Western lands. So Western Slavs spent the next several centuries torturing and melding it into shape, inventing weird dots, hooks, slashes, and digraphs to Slavicize Latin to make it fit our weird sounds. After the 1863 January Uprising, the Russian Empire ordered Polish language schoolbooks printed in Cyrillic. This was insane because it was the first time in 1,000 years that Cyrillic was actually offered to Western Slavic populations. However, obviously the Poles rejected this fiercely. Not because Polish couldn't be written in Cyrillic, in fact it kind of fits very well with the language, but it failed instead because by 1863 the alphabet wasn't just a tool anymore, it was part of the identity itself. Just look at Croatia for example, they're Catholic, they use the Latin script, and yet the old Slavic alphabet of Glagolitic from earlier actually survived in pockets on the Croatian coast all the way into the 1960s. I think that's so sad that it died out, but the reason it could survive because it had permanent papal exemption, which other Western Slavs did not get. So Rome could actually tolerate Glagolitic when it was politically harmless, which is clean proof that the 885 ban was never about theology, it was about politics. Although, like I said earlier in the video, back then, politics was directly and structurally linked with religion. I also have to cover the elephant in the room, and that being Romania is Orthodox and yet they use the Latin alphabet. Why? Well, they justified this because Romanian was actually a Romance language instead. And because it wasn't Slavic, Latin scripts actually fits Romanian better. So when they wanted to reorient towards Western Europe and reclaim their identity as the descendants of Rome, you know, Rome, Romania, the alphabet swap wasn't only symbolic but also made linguistic sense. This reminded me a lot of Ataturk. You know how Mustafa Ataturk did the exact same thing but in Turkey. He switched from the Arabic script into the Latin alphabet, which is kind of unheard of in the Middle East. He did this because the Latin alphabet equals westernization, and this pattern repeats itself across history. Alphabets are symbolically extremely important even in modern times. Mongolia, which adopted Cyrillic under Soviet communist pressure in the 1940s, is currently transitioning back to its traditional Mongolian script as a deliberate distancing from Russian influence. And the cleanest proof of this whole thesis is with Serbia and Croatia, since Serbian and Croatian were so similar that speakers understood each other without effort. Many people just consider it one language, and yet one standardized around Cyrillic and the other around Latin, because Croatia was Catholic and Western, while Serbia was Orthodox and Russian. But then you have Bosnia and Montenegro, which both officially recognize both alphabets. Bosnia is split into ethnic lines. It has a very weird government with many religions, and Bosnian Serbs use Cyrillic while everyone else uses Latin. And Montenegro also constitutionally enshrines both scripts simultaneously, and Serbia itself is officially Cyrillic, but in practice Latin dominates because it's so practical, especially in advertising and the internet. Putin a couple months ago passed a law banning Latin scripts from new residential complex names, and he also pushed businesses to replace Latin signage and logos with Cyrillic logos. Putin is proudly continuing the Russian tradition of suppressing the Latin alphabet. And because of Russia's structural imperialism, many countries are trying to distance themselves from Cyrillic because it is kind of associated with Russia nowadays. Kazakhstan, for example, is in the mid of a transition from Cyrillic to Latin, formally started in 2017. Officially they say it's because of the internet, but unofficially it's about de-Russification. The opposition in Belarus is keeping alive an alternate Latin-based script called Łachinka. Ukraine, since the 2022 invasion, has had many serious public discussions about Latin transliteration. Nowadays, Cyrillic is extremely symbolically linked to Russia, like I said. Countries yearn for democracy, liberalism, and prosperity. And this is why we need to create a European federation, so free liberal states can work together to counter Russian, American, and Chinese imperialism while building a European military-industrial complex and removing the veto. I believe we're closer to major reform right now than we think. All we need is to tip the first domino. And if you agree with me, consider clicking the first link in the description. But in summary, the reason why Western Slavs don't use Cyrillic is because they prioritize getting closer to Western Europe culturally, religiously, and politically over linguistic practicality. The language that eventually kinda became Cyrillic was born in Western Slavic Latin lands, and they threw this Slavic language away for the Eastern Slavs to adopt it instead. When the Western Slavs choose Latin, they didn't choose a practical alphabet, instead they chose civilization. And the rest of European history is in some way a consequence of this choice. Imagine how Polish would sound today if Glagolitic had survived in 8085 or it adopted Cyrillic instead. The entire linguistic landscape of the Slavic world looks the way it does because of the butterfly effect of some bloke losing a race 1,000 years ago. Let me know in the comments if the Western Slavs should have chosen a different alphabet than Latin. Should we convert to Cyrillic today? If you enjoy videos like this, check out the language and history playlist and maybe consider liking and subscribing. You can always unsubscribe later. And also huge thanks to Yoda for the video idea, and a huge thanks to Atlantis and Neberon for being the only channel members. And as always, farewell, żegnam, and goodbye.